Good morning, and thank you for joining me in another of the Chamber's continuing series on ESG. I'm Tom Quadman with the Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness at the Chamber. We are coming to a critical juncture on ESG issues as the SEC is inching closer to issuing proposals on climate change disclosures, as well as potential disclosure on human capital management. This series is dedicated to exploring the issues, how they can affect public companies, and how we can get to realistic and practical rules in ESG. We are honored today to be joined by Jay Clayton, immediate past chair of the SEC and currently of counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell. Jay Clayton, before he joined the SEC, was regarded as the foremost IPO attorney in the United States. I'd like to have Jay Clayton join us on the virtual stage. So Jay, come on up. How are you today?
I'm well, Tom. Thank you. It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you, and thank you for joining us. And Jay, I want to jump right into it. There's been a lot of discussion about ESG, and there's people trying to figure out what's going on and the like. Yet, when you were at the SEC, you actually promulgated the first ESG rule. And it was actually on the S side. So can you talk a little bit about that and what the process was and what you were looking to accomplish with that?
Sure, Tom. And I think you're referring to our rule or the SEC's rule around human capital disclosure.
That's correct.
And let me give you the basis for it, like any new rule, and then how we approach it. The basis for it is the economy has changed over the last 30 years. And the importance of what we refer to as human capital, or managing, promoting, curating your workforce, has become greater, particularly in some of the industries that didn't exist 50 years ago, or the tech and the like. Do you have the talent to compete on the global stage? And we recognize that, and we promulgated a rule that was fairly straightforward, but I also think fairly valuable as we enter this new area, which was, company, please tell us how you look at human capital management. If you use metrics to look at your workforce, their level of training, their level of sophistication, competition with your peers, with other industries, tell us about how you do that. And the idea behind that is pretty simple, and it's the basis for a lot of securities law disclosure, which is for management and the board of directors of a company to share with the investment community how they look at the company. That is some of the most valuable information. Now, let me say that we all recognize that you don't have to take that as the only way to look at the company, but it's a very good place to start, because now what I expect to see over the next 2, 3, 4 years is the analyst community engage with the company around those metrics and ask questions about those metrics, and use those metrics to compare across sectors and within a sector. So I thought this was a very good way to start down this road. Others think we should just go to a set of metrics and apply them across all industries, metrics that maybe are not picked by people who manage companies, but picked from other sources. I don't think that was the right way to start this journey.
So I just want to explore that a little bit further, because I remember a couple of years ago speaking to somebody in the asset management community when we were talking about ESG generally, and this person made the point of, you know what, we need 3 to 5 years of statistics and metrics, and then we can really determine what it is that's material or not. And effectively, what you did with the human capital management disclosure, right, is, and I'm going to oversimplify it a bit, was to say, like, okay, companies, investors, get together, figure out what the relevant or material information is, and then build the disclosure and then disclose it. That principles-based rule, right, has been on the books for a year and a half, a little bit more than that. And as you alluded to, the current SEC is possibly looking at doing a much more prescriptive rulemaking around that. So do you think that the principles-based rule has been in place long enough that investors and companies have been engaged in those discussions, or should we let that stay? Should we let that process play itself out more?
Well, look, I think it's the right way to get to metrics in various industries that help people make better investment decisions. I think it's a more organic way to do it. So yes, I mean it's the way that we chose, and I have not changed my mind. I think, Tom, one of the things that's going on here is what is the purpose of human capital disclosure? If the purpose of human capital disclosure is to facilitate investment decisions, then I think the approach that the commission took made a whole lot of sense. If you have objectives beyond investment decisions, and there are many legitimate objectives for disclosure beyond the SEC's purview, just thinking and knowing about the workforce in America and the like. We have a Department of Labor. This is their job. If there are disclosures for other reasons, who am I to say that those are right or wrong? But that's really not the SEC's purview. That's the Department of Labor's purview. And one of the things that I've asked is there's a whole lot of data out there. What data are investors using today to make these investment decisions? And by and large, the response was it's the information coming directly from the companies.
So I want to hopscotch a little bit and want to ask you, putting your chairman's hat back on for a second. The commission during your time did a lot of rulemakings and looked at old rules, did some new things, and generally you were having a comment period of about 60 days or so on average for those rules. And recently, Chairman Gensler spoke before the Exchequer Club, and I asked him a question regarding comment periods, because we're finding comment periods now are about 30 days. And matter of fact, during the proxy advisory firm comment letter that we submitted in late December, we actually made the point of saying we weren't able to consult our membership enough really to give informed comments. So from your vantage point as chair, do you think that longer comment periods are important to solicit input, or is speed more important to get things done?
Look, you have to have a sufficient comment period to allow people to digest the rule and do the analysis necessary, consult with their members, as you point out. And that varies depending on the scope of the rule, not just its words, but its impact. And during my tenure, I can tell you that whatever our average was, on many occasions, there were folks who came in and said, "Can we please have more time?" And we tried to get it right, so that if you thought about what you needed to do an economic analysis, to canvass your members, to consult with people who operate in the industry, that you would have sufficient time. And I did take the comments that came in from people about not having sufficient time to do analysis and the like seriously, and so did the staff. So to the extent that window has materially been reduced, I do think it's appropriate for people to ask questions about whether they're able to do the analysis, particularly the economic analysis, the data churning that you may need in some of these areas.
So we could not have a discussion about ESG without talking about climate disclosures. And in fact, later in the program, we're going to have a couple panels that are really going to look at scope 3 disclosures. What was interesting, last year we did a survey with NASDAQ where we got over 400 responses from C-suite, from CEOs, from general counsels, companies of all sizes. And basically, they came back and were like, well, we're doing 76% more climate disclosure than we had been before. So to some degree, that principle-based discussion is happening. But, look, it's clear we're going to have a rule proposal. We're going to have, some more guardrails around what should be disclosed around climate. Some industries are already doing that because they see it as a business risk that should be disclosed. How do you see climate disclosures? How should they be developed? How do you see that issue? How should it be dealt with?
Well, Tom, let's level set. We already have a climate change, climate impact, climate regulation disclosure scheme. There is as you noted, there is a great deal of disclosure that is already available to investors about how a particular company is addressing climate regulation, expected climate regulation, planning their business for the future. So the question is, how do we improve that? And let me make this point. It is very difficult to have a disclosure system that is based on future climate regulation impact and future climate change impact. Those two things, some people refer to them as transition, some people and risk. Whatever you want to call them, it's very difficult to craft a more specific disclosure scheme unless you agree on what those policies are. So, for example, if we had a national policy that was carbon neutrality 2050 with some flesh on those bones, it would be much easier to craft more specific disclosure rules. We don't have that yet. And what I feel is happening here is that climate policy is being assumed, and that assumption then informs the rules that are being crafted. And who is assuming that climate policy? Well, it seems to be, whatever agency is pursuing their particular rules. That's a very confused and likely highly suboptimal way to go about this.
So, lastly, again, we could not have a conversation without talking about IPOs. And we had done a lot of work at the chamber, talking about and trying to make some proposals around to arrest the decline of public companies that was occurring. And during your time at the SEC, you and Bill Hinman brought your private sector experience to bear and really tried to rebalance some policies to make it easier for companies to grow from small to large. In other areas, you actually created new regulations to help with that. And last year, we had probably the most successful IPO year since the late 90s. So a lot had turned around with that. Do you see that hospitable atmosphere continuing? Is policy keeping pace with that? And just lastly, you always looked at this in terms of U.S. competitiveness. And are we keeping our eye on that ball?
Wow, there's a lot there, Tom. Look, the nimble nature of capital and labor in the United States is one of our foremost competitive advantages. There's no doubt about that. The ability of capital and labor to move, to use our markets, to move into new industries is what has enabled the United States to be at the forefront of the economic changes we've seen over the last 30 years, manifesting itself in tech today. It's pretty remarkable that a country that has 4.4% of the world population basically has what I would say is 70% of the world's leading companies and an even larger percentage of the world's leading companies in new industries. That is something that we need to stay laser focused on. The ability to raise, deploy, and move capital around in response to market developments. So, was that at the forefront of my mind, Bill Hinman's mind, the entire time we were at the SEC? Absolutely, because who does that benefit? It benefits the 50 million Americans who are invested in our capital markets. The fact that 50% of the world's revenues flow through companies listed, largely U.S. companies on our exchanges, pretty remarkable. So what do we have to do to maintain that and make that efficient, make that system continue to be not only the most efficient, but the most protective in the world, you need to stay laser focused on it. And I think that's what we did.
Well, Jay, thank you very much. Again, thank you for your leadership at the SEC, which benefited all Americans. Thank you for joining us today. And something tells me we're going to be talking about these issues more. So we will welcome you back to the virtual stage. So thank you very much. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Take care.
Bye now. I'm going to now welcome Chuck Chadovitz with our next panel.
Thank you, Tom, for including the Chamber's Energy and Environment team in this important session. As Tom's discussions illustrated, companies are receiving significant pressure from investors, employees, and customers to report on ESG progress, including and especially around climate. As all of you know, the business community has been making commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and is taking the steps to meet these ambitious goals. CCMC's summer 2021 ESG survey, as Tom discussed, underscored that more and more companies are voluntarily reporting as part of this energy transition. And there are many public and private platforms that are currently collecting this information. The U.S. Chamber is working proactively to explore policies that offer flexibility and characterize risks based on business decisions and linked to materiality rooted in decision-useful information. Scope 1 and 2 are fairly straightforward, but Scope 3 is very complex, and companies at various levels of sophistication and readiness to gather this Scope 3 data. It's simply too early to require Scope 3 across the board. Should the SEC move forward and include Scope 3 in the upcoming rulemaking, they'll find that companies will likely not be able to comply completely and that the cost to do so will be significant. So I'm very pleased to introduce our panel to offer perspectives on the challenges that surround Scope 3. And I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage our panel. So I'll welcome Penny Rostow, Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs and Deputy General Counsel at NAREIT, the industry representative for the Real Estate Investment Trusts, Scott Kimple, Partner at Hutton, Andrews & Kurth, and Mark DeCourcy, Senior Vice President at the U.S. Chamber Foundation and Head of our Corporate Citizenship Center. Welcome. So let's start with you, Scott. Want to see if we can level set on what Scope 3 generally is. Can you tell us what Scope 3 emissions are and how companies think about communicating information related to Scope 3 emissions?
Sure. So there are different standards that go into this, but we're talking about the main greenhouse gas one that is what most companies use when they're talking about these emissions. Scope 1 emissions, of course, are the direct emissions associated with manufacturing a product, not relevant for companies in a service economy. Scope 2 are your emissions that are associated with electric generation to power your business. And Scope 3 is everything else that's upstream and downstream. And it's a very broad concept. It's one that requires a lot of judgment and assumptions by management. It requires a lot of judgment by your counterparties up and downstream from you to determine what someone else's Scope 3 emissions are. And I think that's a lot of the challenges here. And if I could provide maybe just a very simple example, and maybe simple is in air quotes, of how this all works. Let's assume a hypothetical product. We're manufacturing an automobile in the United States. So the manufacturer of that automobile is going to have Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions associated with its manufacturer. And then Scope 3 emissions as the vehicle drives down the road. Now, the electric utility that powers that manufacturer is going to have Scope 1 emissions and will also have Scope 3 emissions if the vehicles are electric. Let's assume it's a conventional gasoline-powered automobile. Well, you've got upstream companies that are extracting oil and gas. They'll have Scope 1 and 2 emissions getting that gas downstream, and they'll have Scope 3 emissions when the vehicle ultimately burns it. There's a midstream company that's going to have Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions as it transits the hydrocarbons to the refinery and then out to the ultimate service station. There's a downstream refiner that will generate probably Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions refining the crude oil and Scope 3 emissions when the vehicle's driven. There's a retail service station that will ultimately sell the gasoline to the consumer. If it's a gas-powered automobile, they'll have scope 2 and scope 3 emissions on that automobile. Let's assume it's an electric car and it pulls into one of those nice little charging stations that are popping up in big cities. Well, whoever operates that charging station will have scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And foreshadowing maybe a little bit of what Penny will talk about, the landlord of that charging station will have scope 3 emissions for that automobile. Let's assume a bank has loaned to the automobile manufacturer, the utility, and one of the refiners. Well, the bank scope 3 emissions include all of their emissions on that automobile. Let's assume a private equity firm owns a controlling position in the upstream company that extracted the hydrocarbons in the first place. Those are scope 3 emissions. And let's assume the car is in some sort of recall, there's a class action, and I as a lawyer fly to a hearing in that case. Well, my scope 3 emissions of my law firm are the emissions that come from me flying around the country. So this, I think, raises two policy questions. One, for one automobile, how many times are we going to measure its emissions? And secondarily, why would the SEC want to insert itself into this process, given all the other things on its plate right now? So hopefully that sets the stage for the rest of our discussion.
Thanks so much. Really helpful and definitely underscores the complexities of this issue. Penny, what can you tell us about the real estate industry's experience with Scope 3, and how would you describe what reporting you're doing?
Well, thank you. I mean, first, I just want to say that in general, I've been overwhelmed by the extent to which the real estate industry and the REIT sector and the executives and the boards and the other stakeholders associated with that industry truly do want to be responsible stewards of their own resources and the planet's resources. The public real estate and REIT sector were very early adopters of scopes 1 and 2 reporting. There's enormous expertise in that reporting right now in the sector, but scope 3 remains a work in progress, and it's likely to for many years. The overwhelming bulk of scope 3 emissions for REITs and other public real estate companies is, of course, their tenant emissions. And the tenant's business is wholly independent of the REIT and other public real estate owners' business. It's not a principal agent relationship. These are totally independent counterparties. And under U.S. commercial leasing practice going back decades and the state laws governing it, commercial real estate landlords generally don't even have the right to demand that their tenants provide this greenhouse gas emissions data and in a timely way with any assurance of the reliability of such data. Now, some REITs and other public real estate owners have been able to report scope 3 emissions data for some of their properties in certain jurisdictions where the public utilities have started to provide energy consumption data on a building by building basis. This is a relatively small number of jurisdictions, primarily on the 2 coasts. If this practice were to expand, then more REITs and other public real estate could report their tenant emissions data. Also, some REITs have been able to transition tenants to so-called green leases, which can include provisions in the lease that require tenants to provide emissions data. But this will not be a quick process. Commercial leases in the United States tend to be very long-term, 10, 20, 30 years. So this would be a very long-term project to transition tenants to these types of leases. And it also doesn't resolve an issue that I think Scott will address, which is, the extent to which an SEC registrant can comfortably report third-party data under the Exchange Act rules and liabilities without some kind of assurance or some other kind of protection. So all in all, I think it's going to be a long-term process, which is why in our comment to the SEC in June, responding to its request for information, we suggested that at this juncture, REITs and other public real estate companies should only be required to report greenhouse gas emissions arising from operations under their direct and immediate control.
Thanks so much, Penny. Mark, I wanted to turn to you now. Can you expand the aperture of what Penny just described? The Chamber Foundation recently concluded a series of company roundtables on ESG where Scope 3 came up in conversations very regularly. From those conversations, what's top of mind for companies when they talk about Scope 3?
Yeah, no, thank you, Chuck, for having me here. And we've had those conversations. And to Scott's point, I think even the most advanced compliance departments in the largest companies would have a problem with that flow chart, right? Now, imagine for a second if you're not one of those bigger companies and you're a smaller company. How in the world would you ever be able to track all this? It would be really tough. So what we've learned, right, is companies reporting on Scope 3 depends on a few things: its structure and its investors, to name two. So, for example, a company with an integrated supply chain would likely include more emissions under Scope 1 and 2 than a company with less integrated supply chain, right? So the difference in those emissions also depend on a company's size and, as mentioned before, product. So what the Chamber Foundation heard is, there's an overall concern about the usefulness of Scope 3 emission disclosures, particularly around what a lot of people are calling comparability. So what we've learned, according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you can't compare one company's Scope 3 emissions against another company's. Also, there's not one standardized method for collecting that information. So there can be differences in Scope 3 and differences across industry segments too. How they collect the information, what methodologies they use to collect the information, so on and so forth. So Chamber Foundation, we started talking to these large companies about their ESG issues in 2018. And a lot of the conversations then had to do with how companies were reporting and communicating their efforts, particularly to investors who were using ESG to make investment decisions. Fast forward a few years, we continued the discussion in the ESG ecosystem with larger companies, both individually and in smaller focus groups. And the conversation shifted a little bit. Now they included a broader understanding of both what counted as an ESG effort, which includes, of course, the scopes, and which corporate stakeholders were taking an interest. So one of the ways that was changing how the corporations track their ESG issues was up and down, what most relevant to this discussion, their supply chain. And we heard some more things too that's important. That large companies, they're already struggling with frequent and often mismatched requests and demands for the ESG metrics from a variety of stakeholders. When measuring Scope 3 impacts, this complexity gets passed along through their supply chain. And those companies are even less equipped to handle multiple and different requests to track ESG information, especially between corporate partners who are tracking differently. So you bundle this all together, and what we heard was there's really this importance of what a lot of people are calling harmonization when it comes to ESG, and particularly around Scope 3 in this instance. And this means finding private sector led metrics and benchmarks organized amongst industries as appropriate. It would make it a whole lot easier for smaller suppliers to concentrate on the primary ESG issues, which is what would include Scope 1 and 2.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. Staying with you, what did the Foundation's conversations reveal about the cost of aggregating and disclosing the Scope 3 information?
We found a lot, Chuck. So there's a problem with the novelty of this, Scope 3 information. It's not always clear where to start, how to collect, and it presents a challenge, right, to accurately measure this information and not just estimate it, because that's important. Companies would need to attempt to gather emissions data from a long list of third parties, much like what Scott articulated very well at the beginning of the panel, including second and third tier suppliers who have component parts or raw materials. And many of those, they don't have an obligation to aggregate emissions information, and they might not even be measuring it themselves. So since Scope 3 reporting in its nascency, this is going to be incredibly hard. And it's a question of whether or not, how much of this is going to drive cost. And we found some really interesting feedback at the companies that we talked to, both large and small. So we know that the large compliance departments, they're going to have a challenge. And the small and medium-sized businesses, it'll be next to impossible. So a lot of our foundation's work here at the Chamber is around expanding women and minority-owned small businesses by connecting them more efficiently to supply chains, right? It's a problem that everyone's tackling. And these larger businesses, they want to do this. So what we've learned, minority and women-owned businesses, and we knew that they were disproportionately impacted by COVID. So let's use the COVID example. So there's some recent research that shows that women-owned businesses were 14% more likely to close, Asian American, 18% more likely to close during COVID, Latinx, 45%, and Black-owned businesses, 86% more likely to close during COVID. They're all starting to rebound, but this will come at a really bad time for them if they're going to be forced to start worrying about scope 3. What we do know is that these larger companies, they want the minority-owned businesses in their supply chain. The minority-owned businesses, there's disproportionately smaller and fewer in number to begin with. And what they need is access to capital. They need network engagement. And most importantly for this conversation, they need to be engaged in business supply chains. And this might be a prohibitor for that. So as these small businesses want to offer their products and services to the larger ones, we think that this is going to come at the worst possible time as they're struggling to recover from the pandemic. What will end up happening, unfortunately, is I think larger companies, if they're forced to ask their supply chains to come up with this information, it's going to not going to go well. And these larger corporations might start turning to larger suppliers, which will box out some of the smaller suppliers that we're actually trying to help. And that's going to be a huge issue as we move forward.
Really important issues you raised, Mark. Really appreciate it. Penny, now turning back to you. As you know, the SEC is deliberating on how to proceed on the proposed climate reporting rule and is thinking carefully about the role of scope 3 disclosures and what it should play in the rulemaking. In your view, would an across-the-board requirement to disclose scope 3 information be practical? And is it reasonable to think that scope 3 information is relevant to every industry in the same way? For instance, and what's right for a REIT, theoretically, right for, say, a technology company?
Well, Chuck, I think that's a very important question. And I wouldn't presume to speak for any industry other than public real estate and REITs here. But I think we feel there's enough distinguishing issues and features and constraints in our sector that I have to believe that there's comparable and analogous issues in other sectors, and it will be difficult to produce this data, to produce it in a manner and with the kind of quality and assurance that SEC registrants typically require to report data under the securities laws. As for how useful it's going to be, again, I wouldn't presume to speak for all investors, but it's clear to me looking at this, there's enormous potential to confuse investors. There's the double counting issue that Scott's example very capably illustrated, and I think that's confusing. But I personally have some skepticism as to whether a reasonable investor can be expected to acquire sufficient understanding of greenhouse gas emissions that are generated upstream and downstream, how these emissions are converted into equivalent units of CO2, and whether they really can assess the extent to which an SEC registrant has an opportunity to control or in any way influence those third-party emissions. So I think there's a number of issues here that I think really need to be thought through.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Scott, saying with the rulemaking, if companies are required to report climate metrics in a new rule, what should they generally be thinking about from a liability perspective, especially related to scope 3? And could there be unintended consequences of requiring scope 3 information?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big concerns right now. I mean, as my co-panelists have identified, there's a lot of imprecision in the collection of this information. We've already kind of run this experiment at the SEC with conflict minerals reporting, which has required you to sort of go up and down your supply chain to produce information. And 10 years out, it still remains a challenge to get useful information that's accurate. And what do you do when you have a supplier several rungs down the ladder that just doesn't want to cooperate? Of course, in the context of any SEC disclosure, there's a huge liability regime that registrants, I'm sure, are concerned about. I know my clients certainly are. When you unpack the GHG protocol for scope 3 emissions, there's something like 15 different dimensions that have to be reported on. I'm not aware of any company that reports on all 15. When you get into the individual dimensions that are relevant to their businesses, there's a great deal of assumptions and managerial judgment that go into the calculations. We've worked with companies to do those calculations, and when you roll up your sleeve and you start trying to compare to what other companies are doing, and you can see that they're using different mathematical formulas and different multipliers and algebraic equations, and all of this is inherently forward-looking. This comes at a time when the protections around forward-looking information seem to be under attack at the SEC, particularly in the context of certain industries, and it's against the liability regime that can include strict liability in some cases. The SEC can bring negligence-based charges against companies. We've seen state attorneys general. Everyone's familiar with the New York's Martin Act, which is another strict liability regime that's been used for many, many years against companies that are considered to be greenhouse gas emitters. So it's a real challenge to put together information that a company is comfortable with and that can go through the process that's required to make a filing with the SEC. And then when you do it, you would have to cross your fingers and hope that any number of different plaintiffs don't emerge to immediately challenge it. And I think that's going to be the real challenge here. And I'm just not optimistic that the current makeup of the SEC is going to be sympathetic to these concerns, and that will make this process even more difficult.
Thanks so much. It's clear from our conversations today that Scope 3 emissions are very challenging and complex. I think we at the Chamber are looking to have that discussion with our members to work through some of these issues, and then to provide a forum to engage the SEC in the rulemaking process. So looking forward to working with all of you. Thanks so much to the panelists for today's discussion. I'll now turn it over to Stephanie Maloney with the Chamber's Litigation Center for a panel discussion about liability related to ESG.
As Chuck said, I'm Stephanie Maloney with the Chamber's Litigation Center. I'm very pleased to be leading this morning's panel on liability. A few quick introductions. I'm joined this morning by Julia Malkina, who's a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell and co-lead of the firm's securities litigation practice, Brian Richmond, an associate at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and Matt Webb, senior vice president here at the Chamber's Institute for Legal Reform. There's a lot to talk about in this space, so Julia, I'll kick things off with you. Over the last decade, ESG has developed from a relatively parochial investor theory to an entrenched concept in markets. Have we seen the same occur in the ESG litigation space, and can you characterize for us sort of the state of ESG related litigation today?
Thanks very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you about these timely and important issues. I'll start with a few overarching themes for the ESG litigation space. I think first, ESG-related litigation comes in many different forms and is brought by many different actors. Some is pure impact litigation. Some is about dollars and cents. Some is a new phenomenon, while some is centered on familiar causes of action. Second, success is often defined differently in ESG litigation. Some suits are not brought to win in a traditional sense because they're unlikely to succeed under applicable law. But they draw attention to issues, and they may put companies in a negative light, sometimes resulting in large settlements. Third, our panel is focusing on the US landscape today, but it's important to consider all jurisdictions that a company operates in, since the litigation risks are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and the interest really is global. Now moving to a few major areas of ESG litigation we're seeing, I'll start with securities fraud class action litigation, challenging ESG-related statements. This is often event-driven litigation, such as litigation following environmental events or Me Too allegations. We're also seeing common law fraud claims in state courts that are proceeding under similar theories. Another major area of ESG-related litigation that we've seen is derivative litigation, seeking to hold boards accountable for perceived failures on ESG matters. These have largely been in the diversity space, but they may move into other areas as well. Another area that we've seen ESG-related litigation in is false advertising suits, challenging ESG-related claims about products. For example, suits challenging commitments to sustainability that are made with relation to certain types of products. And another major area we've seen is really climate-related suits by state AGs and municipalities against major natural resources companies. And I think those have been in the media quite a bit over recent years.
Thanks, Julia. That really highlights the growing interest in ESG. Matt Webb, do we have you? I don't see you on the screen.
Yep, I think I just popped up. So
great. Yeah, thank you for joining. I know we had some trouble getting you on. I want to turn to you next, and can you tell us a bit more about where the risks are coming from and how they're presented?
yeah, and I mean, this is kind of picking up from what Julia was mentioning. I mean, there really is almost a taxonomy of litigation related to ESG related matters. So, I mean, there are multiple sources of risk at this point. So the way I kind of divide it up, I mean, you have government related or government investigation related risk. You have private litigation risk. That's both securities law related as well as under the more general corporate laws. You've got SEC enforcement related risk. And then you also have the risk associated with legislative oversight activities. And it's kind of looking at all of those in turn. I mean, on the government investigation side, as Julia mentioned, I mean, most of that litigation tends to be based on consumer protection statutes. So, for example, your ESG related disclosures that you're making, particularly in the realm of advertisements, they can be litigated under unfair and deceptive trade practices sorts of standards. So you have litigation by the FTC related to what's called greenwashing. So you've got that concern of basically what you as a company are saying as far as your commitment to environmental standards may not necessarily be in line with what you as a company are actually doing. But particularly as you're talking about it in your marketing. In addition, you have state AG activity, also under their Consumer Protection Authority. But then also, as Scott mentioned on the previous panel, you've also got potential liability under things like the New York Martin Act. So some of the more high stakes litigation in this space actually has been coming from the state AGs. On the private litigation side, you have more traditional securities related litigation based on what sorts of information you're putting into your actual SEC filings. That's probably been a little less of a concern right now because obviously those filings tend to be very heavily scrutinized and lawyered before they're submitted. But you also have event-driven litigation. So basically you have a bad event happen or series of events occur, and basically that you've put into your either marketing materials or ESG reports that you're following certain standards, and then there ends up being a dichotomy between what those standards that you supposedly are following versus the negative event that occurred. And then finally, directors can have potential liability under just more generalized corporate law for breaching their duties of care and loyalty. So in this space, I mean, it's a difficult case for plaintiffs to file because of the business judgment rule, but that is not an absolute shield because, I mean, there have been some cases where liability has been imposed on directors. And then on the SEC enforcement side, you've got basically investigations on information that you're putting into your filings, particularly if your filings are different than what you're putting into your other materials. And then you also have the follow-up risk from private litigation if the SEC starts investigating or filing a suit. And then The final item, just to flag, as I mentioned, is legislative oversight related activity, where you have congressional investigations that are looking into your practices, your statements, and then at a certain level ends up almost being free discovery for enforcement authorities or private litigants to come after you for allegedly false statements. And but with that, I mean, I would turn it back over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Matt. Brian, I want to go to you to delve a little bit more into Matt's point on the SEC. Obviously, the SEC plays a huge role in the ESG conversation. How has ESG played out at the SEC so far, and what have been some recent developments there?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. So the SEC has dramatically increased its focus on ESG in the last few years, and in particular on climate change issues. In just the last year, the Commission announced that it had hired its first senior policy advisor for climate and ESG. It created a climate and ESG task force as part of the Division of Enforcement. It directed the Division of Corporation Finance to enhance its focus on climate change disclosures. The Division of Examinations announced that its 2021 priorities would focus in part on climate-related risks. And potentially most significantly, the Commission solicited input from investors, issuers, and other market participants on a potential mandatory ESG-related disclosure rule. As all of these announcements, I think, foreshadow, the SEC greatly increased its climate-related and ESG-related activity, scrutinizing through multiple channels climate-related claims and forward-looking statements. So I'll address just two developments here. So the first, enforcement's initial focus appeared to have been, at least in part, on asset management firms. According to Wall Street Journal reporting, the SEC and DOJ are investigating whether certain asset managers overstated the extent to which they relied on or used sustainable investment criteria in managing their assets. And second, and this relates directly to issuers, the staff in the Division of Corporation Finance has been scrutinizing companies' climate change disclosures. So as many of you already know, in the fall, the staff issued a number of comment letters relating exclusively to climate change disclosure issues. I would encourage anyone interested in this topic to review those sample Dear CFO letters that the SEC has posted to its website. These letters asked companies to provide information on various ESG-related issues, including material litigation and regulatory risks related to climate change, and to explain why certain information disclosed in companies' corporate social responsibility statements or sustainability reports were not included in SEC filings. While I don't think these letters should be read as a mandate to include any type of wide-ranging climate change discussions in a company's filings, I do think they demonstrate the types of questions that issuers could expect to receive in the future related to ESG matters. And they could also indicate areas where the task force or the Division of Enforcement is likely to focus in the future.
So Julia, going back to you, as we just heard from Brian, there are reasons to be cautious when providing additional information and data related to ESG. And recently, we've seen companies, inclined to make statements related to their ESG goals, to make net zero pledges. Will we see, more private litigation over these goals and statements, especially as companies begin to actually measure their progress against these statements? And are there maybe opportunities related to these goals and statements that outweigh that risk? Can you sort of answer those questions?
Sure. So expressing your ESG related goals is becoming increasingly important to companies. Simply put, it's important to many different constituencies. Company leaders want to put forward the vision of their company. Clients or customers are increasingly deciding how to spend their money in ways that reflect their ESG related commitments. Employees increasingly think about these things in deciding where to work and whether to stay there. Your competitive position is more and more affected by competitors who also are making certain types of statements, and sort of there's becoming in certain industries an expectation that a company will be making those types of statements. So I think increasingly important from many different perspectives for many different companies. In advising our clients on expressing their ESG related goals, we've really been focusing on a number of areas. The first is words matter. From a securities law perspective, how you frame your goals is important. Even the terminology around your goals. Are they goals? Are they aspirations, commitments, pledges, etc.? May come with different liability. The second consideration is that this is a rapidly changing area, and you're definitionally speaking about events in the future. But we've been speaking with our clients about being cautious about binding yourself to specific solutions, technologies, processes, etc. What's considered a best practice today may not be considered a best practice in 5 or 10 years. So being cautious about when you're putting forward your goals, not binding yourself to things that may become less relevant with time. Then, a third thing that we've been focused on is that many statements in this area are forward-looking. And so you have to make sure that the statements are framed as such and that they have appropriate forward-looking disclosures. And that's not only for statements that make it into ultimate SEC filings, because from a securities law perspective, any public statements by a company are potentially actionable. So also being very consistent in including the appropriate forward-looking statements disclosure language, the PowerPoint on ESG related issues that's put up on your website that isn't out of the SEC, making sure you always have that language. A fourth consideration we've been talking about is that measuring your goals is very important, and how you're doing that and your disclosures around how you're doing that are, in some ways almost as important as your goals themselves. So you need to disclose how you're measuring your goals and what your assumptions are in making those measurements. And a fifth area we've been talking a lot about in trying to think towards future potential liability is really consistency from statement to statement. Consistency in how you're framing your different goals, consistency in how you're measuring those goals, consistency in how you're disclosing your measurements and assumptions. I think just sort of consistency across the board here, recognizing that, this is a new area and that your folks are disclosing across different types of ESG measurements and metrics is just really important.
Brian, much of what Julia just laid out, companies are making available on their website. But as we've heard, the SEC is expected soon to propose a detailed rulemaking on climate disclosures that will require companies to file with the SEC much of that same information. What shape is that rulemaking likely to take, and what are some of the things companies should keep an eye out?
That is a great question, Stephanie. So the SEC has not yet set a firm date for any proposed rule, but we expect to see a proposal in probably the first or second quarter this year. Now, there's a lot for the SEC to consider. So for now, I'm going to take just 3 areas to keep an eye on. First is the qualitative versus quantitative focus of the rule. The SEC is likely to require both a qualitative discussion, so how a company's leadership manages climate-related risks and how these risks play into the company's strategy, as well as a quantitative disclosure, such as metrics related to greenhouse gas emissions. This quantitative side of the equation is likely to be an area of particular interest to companies. And the big question here, I think, is whether the SEC is going to mandate disclosure of scope 1 and 2, so more direct emissions, or go further and require disclosure of scope 3, more indirect emissions. As I think the prior panel discussion showed, if the SEC goes into the scope 3 mandate, that would greatly increase the complexity of the proposal and the cost of any proposal. Second, the Commission is going to need to decide whether its climate change disclosures should be included in actual SEC filings, so for example, an annual report, or furnished to the Commission. This filing versus furnished distinction is an important distinction for liability purposes. While either type of disclosure is potentially subject to liability, for example, under Section 10B of the Exchange Act, only filed disclosures could attract liability under Section 18 of the Exchange Act. Third, and this is more of a procedural point, which I'll end on, is companies should be on the lookout for ways to participate in the rulemaking. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, the SEC has an obligation to consider and to reasonably respond to comments submitted as part of the rulemaking record. This is going to be an important opportunity for companies and other interested parties to highlight aspects of the rule that might be unnecessarily burdensome, will not help investors. And this is particularly important, areas where there are reasonable, less onerous alternatives. The SEC is going to have to grapple with these issues. So companies should not be shy about voicing their concerns.
Matt, I want to pick up with you where Brian left off. The SEC has relatively broad authority under the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act to extend safe harbors to information that deems appropriate. How does that sort of play out here?
Yeah, so the PSLRA, as Julia mentioned earlier, does provide a number of liability protections for securities-related communications or filings. So, for example, the one that's most important for this conversation, or basically if they're styled as a forward-looking statement. So the PSLRA basically limits liability for forward-looking statements. I mean, it's not an absolute protection, but it does. But it is a pretty robust shield. So the SEC does have authority under the PSLRA to actually expand the types of protections it can provide beyond just forward-looking statements. So I think this is something that, I mean, as the commission moves forward with any sort of rulemaking activity in this space, that they look at their authority or pre-existing authority under the PSLRA and potentially exercise it to limit the amount of liability for ESG related statements. And their authority to expand that liability protection is pretty significant. And if they would go down that road, I think that would provide a lot of relief to companies as litigation starts to ratchet up in this space.
And
Julie, go ahead, Brian. Jump in.
I was going to say, Stephanie, I would just add on to what to Matt's point. I think this is an area to pay attention to in the rulemaking. To the extent the SEC puts forward any requirements, that could create uncertainty as a litigation matter under the PSLRA. So that type of uncertainty, that type of cost that will be imposed on companies is something the commission is going to have to grapple with as it proposes a rule here.
Julie, I want to close out with you, and I want to sort of look prospectively. Can you share with us how you're advising clients to position themselves for these coming changes at the SEC?
Absolutely. As Brian and Matt have explained, I think there's still significant uncertainty over the exact contours of what will come out of the SEC on climate change disclosures. But the SEC has made clear that it expects robust controls and procedures around non-financial metrics. I think this will apply fully to climate change disclosures. As a result, I think we've had a focus today on ensuring that such controls and procedures are in place around current climate change disclosures and future climate change disclosures. So we've been thinking about that across many different parameters. I think one is consistency in disclosure. What metrics are you disclosing from year to year? How are you measuring those metrics from year to year? The second is really disclosing your assumptions. This is very important. How are you getting to your metrics? What are you excluding? What are you including? What are your baselines? I think especially when you're thinking about Scope 3 emissions, which we talked about earlier in our hour together, how are you measuring those given the complexities involved in Scope 3 emissions? Another one is really ensuring strong internal procedures for collecting data to support climate-related disclosures. Those internal procedures and how you collect that data will be very important in guarding against any future potential liability with respect to your disclosures. So in other words, we're focusing now not only on what climate change related disclosures companies are going to make, but what disclosures they're going to make about how they're making those climate change disclosures. So really the process, the assumptions, the controls, the procedures. And I think one final point is on third-party assurance. This has become increasingly common with ESG metrics. We don't know exactly what the SEC will say with respect to third-party assurance, but if you're thinking about going down the third-party assurance route, it's important to do so early. You don't want to get far in developing your controls and procedures and then learn that from the third-party assurance perspective, the expectation was different with respect to those controls and procedures. So just a few sort of points as we wait and see with respect to what the SEC will come out with.
That's great. Thank you. I think, as is clear from this discussion, there's much to talk about and consider related to ESG and liability. And one thing that we can be certain about is that these conversations will continue. So a big thank you to our panelists for helping us understand better where the risks fall and how they can materialize in the ESG space. And I'll now turn it over to Evan Williams with CCMC for a few closing remarks. Thanks again.
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Evan Williams, and I lead our ESG work here at CCMC. To learn more about the Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness and access the materials referenced today, please visit centerforcapitalmarkets.com. To follow up or learn more about our ESG programming, you can send me a note at ewilliams@uschamber.com. I'd like to offer a special thank you to Sullivan and Cromwell, Gibson Dunn, Hunt and Andrews Kurth, and NAREIT for their participation this morning. I think it's fair to say that our conversations were made better and more informative because of the contributions of these firms, and we're very grateful for your partnership here today. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to today's event. We'll look forward to having you back again for our next installment in our ESG series soon. Thanks very much and take care.